Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Evan Honor with Plant Moran. Welcome to our webinar on ERP selection on the horizon. Think twice before doing it yourself. I'm Evan Honor with Plant Moran's Technology Consulting Group. I'm joined by Craig Zampa, who leads the Selection and Readiness Consulting Group. He has over 20 years experience in the ERP space. He's completed over 25 selections and over 20 plus due diligence activities in the ERP space. We're also joined by Kim Pierce, who's also on the IT consulting practice group. She has deep knowledge in ERP vendors, cost modeling, and vendor analysis. Just the flow of this and the setup of this webinar will be as follows. If you have a question, feel free to submit them anytime using the Q&A widget located at the bottom of your console. You can also download today's slides by clicking on the resource widget at the bottom of your console as well. Today's webinar will be recorded and saved on our internet, on the Plant Moran website for on-demand viewing. So this is a CPE eligible webinar. Throughout the webcast, polling questions will appear. In order to receive credit, you need to answer at least 75% of these questions, an accrued viewing time of over 50 minutes to receive that CPE credit. Archived on-demand webinars are not eligible for CPE credit. To obtain your certificate, click the CPE widget located at the bottom of your console at the end of the session. So the agenda for today is as follows. We'll start off thinking about why some organizations choose to go on their own when selecting an ERP system. We'll talk about what the risks are with using your own resources, your own human capital, your own legacy systems, and your own legacy procedures in selecting a system on your own. Then we'll talk about ways we mitigate that risk, broken down into policy, politics, and priority. So how does Plant Moran and other experts in the ERP space mitigate those do-it-yourself risks? Then we'll look at a brief comparison that compares the time and resources consumed by going it alone, as well as working with a consultant or an ERP expert. And then lastly, we'll look at some important characteristics of ERP partners so you can make an informed decision should you choose to partner up with an ERP consultant like Plant Moran in your project. So again, to begin, we'll start off with a question to our panel here. Why do organizations pursue ERP selections independently and without the support of a subject matter expert?
Sure, Evan. So probably the most frequent thing that we see bubble to the surface is I have the internet available to me. It's a great tool. It's a powerful tool. We live in the age of information. I can go on the internet and I can use Google to search ERP selections. And I can literally get millions of hits returning things like vendor comparisons, product information, case studies, and even some sample tools that I might be able to download in my selection process. It seems simple enough, right? Why wouldn't I be able to use it?
So before this session, I went on yesterday and I actually did a Google. I used Bing, but I went ahead and Googled ERP software and came up with over 13 million hits of varying selections or softwares and all those paid advertisements. It'd be a mess.
Sure.
And even I did a follow-up one where it was ERP software for manufacturing, and that was still 4.5 million hits. So do it yourself on that. That could be pretty daunting.
So much content out there.
Exactly. And sorting through all that content to find the most value certainly can prove to be a challenge if you're pursuing your ERP selection independently. Secondly, although companies often budget for the overall investment required for an ERP solution, a lot of times they'll forget to budget for the process involved in selecting the right solution for their company. And if you consider the solution that you want to select is going to be in place for potentially the next 15 to 20 years, you certainly want to take the time and the budget required to get it done right the first time.
Absolutely. There's a lot of great research out there that shows some companies are expected to hold on to their ERP system for 15 to 20 years. And obviously there's nuances by industry. Some industries are going to replace faster, so there's some margin considerations, but I think you're right. Comparing that cost of selection to the total cost of the system over its lifetime is really a meaningful comparison.
I agree.
Exactly. And finally, many organizations have an IT department, and a lot of them think, well, isn't it the IT department's responsibility to do a selection? They have procurement knowledge, they have vendor knowledge, they live in the software world. So I would think that my IT department would be able to get the activities done necessary to select the appropriate ERP solution for my company.
You know, it's interesting because I spent 16 years in IT prior to joining Plant Moran, and understanding, you know, the peers that I worked with in business and industry. You know, to be honest with you, there is a lot that you may know, but then there's a lot you don't know. You know, you understand, you know, why you go with a Microsoft Exchange instead of a Lotus Notes and those different types of things. But really, having the experience and knowledge of going into the procurement team and helping understand their functional requirements, or digging into you know, production or scheduling. To be honest with you, there's a level of knowledge, but not the same level of knowledge that you would have by working with an external organization that does these ERP selections day in and day out.
From an IT perspective, there are a few decisions that get made less frequently than what ERP system to use. Am I correct in thinking that?
Well, and the interest, you know, absolutely. And the other thing is, you know, we talk about here that they could probably do it in a few weeks. You know, this is something you are making a 15-year decision on. You know, if you think about the major purchases in a manufacturer with buying production equipment, you know, do you go and say, you know what, I'm just going to flip a coin and buy something that's going to be producing, you know, our revenue stream? Of course you don't do that. And so taking that same type of diligence and really thinking through the solution that's going to be driving your entire company is such a critical piece.
Absolutely valuable. Okay, so let's go to our first question here. The question is, have you previously or are you currently considering selecting a replacement ERP solution as a do-it-yourself project?
So it's a simple yes or no question for the audience today to start off. And honestly, it's a great primer question to find out the audience that's joining us. You know, unfortunately, we can't distinguish, okay, did you do it in the past or is it in the future necessarily, but it's still telling because I know we had a very large audience joining us today, that we did see, and which is very exciting, but it's telling that if it's something they did in the past, maybe it didn't turn out exactly as they'd like to see.
Right.
If it's something they're thinking about now, perhaps there's some anxiety of saying, gosh, this is a big decision, and do we just go, you know, kind of do our own thing, or do we bring in an outside firm? Or if they've done it in the past a few years back and said, we bought the wrong stuff, or it wasn't implemented well. Those are just big things that I can imagine instill some anxiety for the audience.
Or are we still in the middle of the selection or implementation,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, the results are in. It's pretty balanced, it looks like. About 46% of our responders said that they have previously or are currently considering a replacement ERP solution, and about 53% said no, they have not previously or are currently considering a replacement ERP solution. And that's pretty interesting to me, because in these times of economic growth and relative prosperity, you see a lot more organizations looking to invest in IT in strategic ways. That's at least what I believe we've seen over the past 2-3 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so there's a couple possibilities on the nose. It could be a scenario where people say, yeah, we are in a place that we understand, we see the business growing, we feel good, and we are bringing in a firm, we're bringing in a Plant Moran or a firm to help us through this process of selecting a new ERP solution, which is great. We'd love to talk to you and help you in that initiative. Other scenarios might be in the no column, that they've recently put in a solution and they're evaluating other related things, and maybe they did use somebody in the past and had a positive experience or what have you. So it's very exciting, but that is interesting, right down the middle.
Yeah, it really is interesting. Okay, so now we'll move on. So let's get a few examples of times when organizations try to do it themselves and maybe face some difficulties or unexpected challenges.
Absolutely. So we wanted to talk about a couple of examples today. The first one we're focused on is a manufacturer and distributor of industrial machine components. What happened is about a year ago we received a call that this client had gone through. They selected their own software. They had actually implemented the software at that point, so it was already in place. And we'll just say that things were not good. There was a lot of discontented leadership. There was a broken or very damaged relationship with the vendor that implemented it. And the reason being, there was three major things they experienced. One is this manufacturer distributor was already running software. They were running a distribution package prior to replacing it. And so the good news is they had the distribution under control and it was working fine. So when they went to search, they said, well, we want to get something that does our manufacturing as well. Well, the problem with is the as well is they ended up not really capturing their distribution requirements. So everything that they went and selected based on was on manufacturing drivers and replaced their ERP with something that leaned too far the other way. And unfortunately, by then they had just gone live, but they were already they were about a year overdue on their initial phase 1 go live, which when you're in an ERP selection or implementation project, something running over a year late is very hard on the employees, and it's very hard on the budget. To be honest with you, the budget ran over by 6 figures from the original plan just on the services, and over 100 mods were created, modifications to the application to make it look more like what they needed, what they thought they needed as a distribution and manufacturing companies. And it was just a really, really difficult situation, being full year overdue and what have you. So it was really based on a simple thing of functional fit. They bought an application that didn't really fit their business appropriately or entirely. And so that definitely could have been mitigated. Another scenario we have is work that we do with private equity. We have a number of private equity firms that we do support for. And one of these firms we've done a lot of work with had purchased into the manufacturing distribution space of industrial components, another organization. Well, what they did is they actually purchased 5 companies that were running 5 different ERP solutions. And one of the holdings had already been in an ERP selection for the past 2 years. So implementations of 2 years, selections of 2 years is not a desirable outcome for most people. And so they spent 2 years trying to find a selection, and guess what? People on the team were off busy doing their day jobs, and they just really didn't prioritize effectively on seeing that project through, and they also didn't know really what they were looking for effectively. So they did reach out to us and say, we need to close the gap on this. We need to get this selection done and start an implementation because we've got 4 other companies to implement with this. Big challenge between that is these were 5 previous competitors that were brought together under one umbrella. So there was a bit of a unification. Any one of these companies that selected a software was going to be a competitor selecting their software for them. So we needed to really work on bringing together the objectivity of this selection and the teams so that they could feel a little better about what they were moving forward with. So those are a couple of examples.
What do you think drove the decision in those organizations to pursue selection independently? Was it they had a lot of confidence in their IT department? Was it they were lean in resources, really not familiar with organizations like ours? What do you think drove those decisions?
In the first case, it was, to be honest with you, them trying to save money. We, I believe, had originally talked to them about this process, and they decided to go about it themselves. So that saving money cost them a lot. So that's something we like to see people avoid. In the second scenario, it was awareness. So again, private equity firm knows this very well, right. But this small organization they purchased, or somewhat small organization, $50 million company, that they purchased, this business unit, they are out in rural town, so they weren't really aware that they should be looking for a partner in doing something like this. So it wasn't that they were trying to avoid spending, it was just more of an awareness thing in their case. Interesting,
very interesting. Alrighty, so next we're going to discuss the organizational resources that in a do-it-yourself environment are being utilized. So we'll start off with what are the strengths? What does an organization bring to the table in terms of internal resources when embarking on a DIY selection?
Sure. So obviously when you're pursuing an ERP selection project, your internal resources are going to be extremely important. So first and foremost, most likely several of your internal staff members have been with your company for maybe 10, 15, or 20 years. This rich history and deep experience brings to the table a very good understanding of what your business is all about, as well as a very deep relationship with your customers and your suppliers. So as you're going through the selection project, your internal staff really are the most critical resources in defining what your requirements are and understanding your business need. In addition, each organization really has a unique political landscape. By that I mean, how are decisions made within the organization and who makes the decisions? And for that matter, why do we need to make a decision, right? So just by virtue of living in that political landscape on a daily basis, your internal staff members know how to navigate that, and they can help identify who those decision makers are.
So one of the things that comes to mind, you had said that, you know, they're aware of what those business requirements are. They're aware of how the business, you know, functions. And that's an extremely valid point in the current state. And that's one of the big takeaways that we're going to be focused on today. It's one thing to be able to look in the rearview mirror and see how business has run, how we do things in the past. But that doesn't necessarily give you the strongest perspective of what the future should look like, because you've done things a certain way for many years and maybe aren't as prepared for that potential evolution that you're facing, especially if you're on an AS400 system for the past 25 years. It's great to have committed, loyal staff, and everybody wants to have that. That's the lifeblood of an organization. However, you need to pretty much consider augmenting some of the knowledge gap that might be there with that scenario.
Maybe just add on that, maybe Craig, you want to talk about the mission of IT. When we deal with clients, how are they structuring their IT department? What's the focus? Maybe how does it impact awareness of ERP?
So it's interesting how it's a very strong understanding that IT, you know, is responsible for the technology of a company. But we were talking here early on that the technology of the company is a part of this, but these are really people-oriented projects. If you buy the best possible software for your business and you put it in poorly, or people are not accepting of it because it was handed to them and they weren't part of the solution, or you didn't necessarily think of all the considerations, it doesn't really matter how good the software is. And so having the best technology is valuable, but it's not everything.
Got it. Okay, let's take some time for some viewer input again. Next question is, how many key managers in your organization have successful experience managing the selection and implementation of a new ERP solution? So we've broken it down in 2 or less, 3 or 5, 6 to 10 or over 10. And obviously that needs to be calibrated for the size of your organization. A large organization has a higher chance of maybe having some seasoned, experienced ERP employees and resources on staff, correct?
Sure.
So what's interesting about that is this can be a little bit of a misnomer in a way too. The idea is, okay, well, I've got more than 10 people, so I'm in good shape. That could actually be risky. Don't want to, you know, guide the audience into a certain direction on the answer. Hopefully you're just stating fact. But saying, well, I've got more than 10 people who've selected software or implemented software in the past, the question is, are those the 6 or 8 or 10 or the 3 to 5 people that you want doing that project? You know, we talked a little bit earlier previously with regards to these might be, in some cases, your best and brightest, and you need them on a daily basis. Or it might be that they're not, you know, they might be experienced in the application of, you know, doing that, but maybe those are the best people to have interacting with gathering requirements or managing key things.
Sure.
Absolutely.
And if these are your resources really that are involved on a day-to-day basis, like you said, your best and your brightest, or if they're involved in other projects, you have to keep in mind that this is not only an ERP selection project, but that knowledge also needs to be carried through to the implementation. And your resources involved in the team need to be really change agents that are going to help to drive that change through the organization.
Absolutely. So I see the answers here.
So it looks like the most respondents, 62%, responded with 2 or less knowledgeable, experienced employees in successful selection and implementation of ERP. And that's relatively consistent with what we see. And the keyword there is successful. We've seen plenty of clients have rich resources who have been at past organizations, but they've been through unsuccessful implementations.
Sure.
Correct? All right. So next, let's look at some gaps, internal resource gaps. The typical misses on a team. What are some of the weaknesses potentially in your internal team when it comes to a DIY project?
Sure. So we talked earlier about all of the critical aspects that your internal staff can bring to the project. But if we think about it, a manufacturer and distributor is first and foremost interested in making and selling their product. We're going to hire staff in order to make and sell product. What they don't do is live in the ERP market and perform ERP selections and implementations on a daily basis. How do you think that impacts the selection process?
So the first one we talk about here is that cost and contract negotiation. And I'll be honest with you, that is, it's at the top for a reason. It's a very, very important key step. And if you think about it, like I was just doing a contract review this morning, it's not just about buying a piece of software. In this scenario, they had to purchase a piece of software, which honestly, most people don't understand how the software market prices or negotiates or lays out the differences between an outright purchase, annual maintenance, how those work together, how they compare in a cloud SaaS type environment versus an on-premise type environment, as well as the legal language. Even giving the contracts over to lawyers and saying, can you please review these, our legal counsel, they come back, they understand the legal aspects, but don't necessarily understand some of the pitfalls that happen in software or in hosting solution providers or third-party environments. So if you think about it, we're going to have contracts on a software, we're going to have contracts on the implementation and statement of work, and making sure that's done well and planned appropriately, as well as what we talked about, third-party applications and hosting. So there's a lot of potential landmines in there that we repeatedly get very positive feedback on how much of an impact that activity makes for a client.
I think it's really important to consider the duration of those contracts, right? Maybe you think for a year, you're locking pricing, but when you're talking about a 5-year contract, the lifetime risk that you pose by signing a poorly written contract really jeopardizes your organization. So how do you create competitive advantage with a strong contract, one that's been scrutinized and evaluated by experts?
Yep. And so next would be just the knowledge of the ERP marketplace and how that impacts the vendors that you want to look at. So even if you've had team members who have gone through a selection before or have knowledge of a few vendors in the marketplace, there's literally hundreds of vendors out there. Some of them might be niche solutions that target a specific industry. Others might be niche solutions that target a specific functionality like human resources or payroll or something of that nature, customer relationship management. Others might be broader based, so they may have a lot of functionality across the entire spectrum. So how do you boil down all of the vendors that are available to the solution that might best fit your needs? And then secondly, there's the technology consideration. Buzzwords come up all the time, right? How does business intelligence, how does CRM or customer relationship management affect my ERP solution? How does cloud computing and the SaaS model affect my ERP solution? Staying on top of all of the technology trends and all of the vendors that are available on the market is definitely a job in and of itself.
Well, I mean, as a firm, we've touched or visited over 100 different solutions that are ERP solutions out there. Now, many of them are not, around anymore, but the idea is it's a very dynamic and organic market. And understanding what the point in time right now is in the ERP space, when you have one application company buying up other people's software, and identifying, these solutions that we're looking at that we Googled and went forward with. Is it a current solution? Is it one that Plant Moran feels is going to be around in 5 years? Is it part of the landscape and the strategy? Because if you talk to the salespeople from a software organization, guess what? The product that they're selling is going to be around in 5 years. The product that they're selling is going to be a very good match for your needs because they don't have an objective view of your goals. They have a bias, to be honest with you. And so being aware of that, I mean, there's one software company that we see come up a lot in ERP selections. And to be honest with you, they have 23 different software packages. 23. Now, granted, some of those are in different business spaces and what have you, but having to navigate that as a customer would be very challenging. And then, like I said, out of those 23, how many of those were bought just to maintain the license base, as opposed to, and then they're going to be moved to another solution.
Sure.
So
we've touched on the last few items on the list as we were going through some of our previous slides. We talked about, even though an ERP project is a technology project, really it's first and foremost a people project. It's about change in your organization. It's about affecting the business processes. And if you don't get the acceptance from the people, ultimately you might pick the best solution available, but it's not going to affect change and improvement in your organization. So finding somebody in the organization that has the ability to manage multiple divisions, multiple functional units across the company, and then really being able to drive the change often creates challenges for organizations. And with that too is really the identification of best practices. We talked earlier about it's easier for your internal staff to rely on the current model. It's comfortable, right? We like to do what we're used to,
sure,
rather than change. So a lot of times inserting the best practice idea or recognizing improvement opportunities throughout the selection project can be difficult for internal resources.
Yeah, definitely. And then finally, just talking about a business case. You know, different scenarios come up with our selection. Some selections, you know, they're running a 25-year-old software package, and we see it all the time. You know, an old solution, AS400 base, what have you, and it's really the key leadership of the organization that says, we want Plant Moran to come in, and frankly, we're not focused on an ROI in this case. It's got to go. So we need to get to selecting. And so
right.
That is a scenario we see. In other scenarios, we see where there is a board of directors in place, and they're trying to replace a solution from 10 years ago that maybe just hasn't been updated over the past 10 years because of custom mods or what have you. And so in those cases, we do have a need for a business case to help justify the expense. And that's something that we really like helping on. So that's a place where people really gap and miss the opportunity or don't have the knowledge to fill those out as effectively. Absolutely. And finally, just want to do a quick story. It's actually a selection that we had just recently done. We do a lot of carve-outs where private equity firms or organizations buy a part of a company and they carve that out. Well, in that case, these customers end up with a freestanding company, but they have really no tools, because that all stays at the parent company. Okay. And so we had a scenario where this $50 million company was carved out of a $5 or $10 billion company. And so that kind of brings some interesting challenges. Now, to be honest with you, they were just, the new company was going to go ahead and just put in the same software that was already in place at the parent company and move on with it. But after we sat down with them and looked, it was an AS400 based solution that ran the operations. It was a separate software package for the financials, and even another one for some of the key operating activities like scale management, what have you. And so it was a really unique scenario. And we stepped back and said, let's take some time and look at what your options are, because implementing all these software packages is going to be a very painful outcome. And we just received confirmation back that they are so glad that they went through and stopped for a moment and thought about it. We were able to find one solution that covered all their business needs, and they could implement once.
That's an excellent example of the risks of the status quo, right? Just trying to maintain the current state and those risks. But before we talk about how we mitigate those risks, let's take some time for another question here. When was the last time your company completed an ERP software implementation? Was it less than 5 years ago, between 5 and 10 years, or more than 10 years? And now, Craig, I know we talked about the average time an organization holds or stays on an ERP being pretty long, 15 plus years in some cases. But do you see some companies being more aggressive in their refresh cycles of ERP systems?
So it's a great point. The 15 years, it's true, you know, that is the average. But we see a couple different scenarios. We'll see a fair amount of them where they implemented a solution 10 years ago, and they want to identify, why should I be bringing it up to date? You know, what was it take? And we had a client actually with operations in Mexico and out east that they just put a solution in 10 years ago, and it's a very prevalent solution. And they said, well, we need to figure out, should we be going to the latest version, because the software company's not going to support the version any longer. And we stepped back and said, that's really an interesting software package that you guys ended up with. Wouldn't say that it's probably the optimal that we see in your industry. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should consider stepping back and actually identifying a selection opportunity and saying, hey, if we looked at all of our options, is there something that better matches our needs before we invest in this upgrade that's going to cost every bit as much as an outright purchase and implementation?
Right. Well, results are in. Let's see what we have here. Again, a pretty balanced response across the options here, but it looks like 45.5% of respondents said the last time they completed an ERP software implementation was over 10 years ago. A lot has changed in 10 years, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
The landscape's changed dramatically from a functionality standpoint, from a delivery model standpoint, from a support standpoint. So more than 10 years, certainly a lot has changed in that time. Then it looks like 25% of respondents said 5 to 10 years, 28% said less than 5. Okay. So next, let's look at how these risks are mitigated. The risks we discussed earlier, how does a company like Plant Moran mitigate the risks that we see?
So as we identify thinking about policy, and I think we're going to dig a little bit more into the risk with regards to internal bias. You know, the reality is the staff that are inside of organizations, oftentimes they're biased towards the tools they have. We usually find that the ERP oftentimes does a portion of the business, and then there's a lot of gap. You know, there's a gap on scheduling, or there's gaps in some of the production or quality. And we find it's pretty common that they actually build their own access databases or really advanced Excel applications. I actually have a client that he calls it Excellence. That's his name for it. And they do it tongue-in-cheek because he knows that they're way overutilizing Excel. But in many scenarios, people are really biased towards that because that's kind of their baby. Right. And so, you know, looking at new solutions or considering a new option is not something that's as easily done. And then the other side of resistance to change is I'm used to doing things a certain way. Why do I have to change? You know, why can't I take a piece of paper and walk around, and when I pick items off of things and put it in a box, you know, put my initials there? I need to have it for history purposes. And it's about, you know, changing the paradigm a little bit and walking people through in a bite-sized chunk manner. That's a risk, though, when you try to do it yourself, because you don't think in that manner necessarily. And finally, the idea of compliance and controls. You know, there are so many different levels of compliance out there. And in the food and beverage space, you know, you have traceability and recall requirements. We've all heard the stories where a major food chain or a major food organization had to recall, you know, thousands of pounds of beef or millions of pounds of beef. And having a way to do that inside of the operating application is big. Well, people don't necessarily think about all these things that might be able to get accomplished inside of their core applications because they haven't really thought in that manner.
Exactly. And I, in fact, was just speaking with a client looking at some software, and they had some fairly stringent international accounting requirements. So they had locations in China and Japan, as well as the United States and Mexico. And so in order to take full advantage of their ERP solution, they really needed to step back and understand, can the solution that I am selecting support me in all of those requirements?
Sure.
So it's critical. So now another area of risk that we've identified is the area of politics inside an organization. We talked earlier, it's natural because an ERP solution is technology, it's software. So it's natural for these projects to be given to the IT department first and foremost. What that does, though, is it eliminates the voice of the business. It takes some of the users out of the process, and in so doing creates somewhat of a vacuum. So you're losing the opportunity to identify improvements as you're going through the selection process, and you're limiting the visibility of the project such that maybe the IT department does select a good solution, but then the users aren't part of that change. And all of a sudden you're telling your users in your shop floor or your sales team that, okay, you have a new solution that you have to learn, rather than them being part of the solution from the very beginning.
Sure.
Secondly, you know, it becomes even more challenging to manage the project when you have multiple business entities because you're trying to harmonize all these different voices and all of these different requirements potentially onto one ERP platform and finding synergies across the company. So trying to manage all of the different requirements, find the improvement opportunities, and then also the synergies across the different functional areas as well as the entities is key. And also we talked a little bit about being able to understand not only my functional requirement within procurement, for example, or within finance, but to understand how that requirement's going to impact upstream and downstream so that you're getting a holistic view of what that requirement is. And then finally, there's the idea of vendor interaction. So without a clearly defined project structure and project team, a lot of times you have several team members communicating with the vendors. Maybe they made contact at a trade show, or maybe they have a neighbor that works for a software company. And suddenly the vendors have multiple people within your organization that they're communicating with regard to the ERP selection. And there's no expectation and no decision-making authority established with the vendor. And we talked as well, vendors are first and foremost salespeople.
Absolutely.
Once you open yourself up to that sales cycle, you're going to be getting calls really on a daily basis.
Yeah. So let's finally talk about some of the risks around priority. Most of the team across the board over at Plant Moran, to be honest with you, has a lot of industry experience. So we all realize what the team members inside of organizations go through. And quite honestly, it's usually about the fire of the day. I mean, that's just the reality that most organizations live in inside of their space. And so stopping to do actual planned projects has not been much of a reality in most cases. So it's great that, you know, we're going to have a meeting at this given time inside of a company, but if half the staff doesn't show up because it's just another meeting, or, you know what, it's an internal project, it's hard to corral the cats, if you will.
Absolutely.
So that's pretty key. And then just basically the skills around scheduling, you know, laying out, this is our schedule for the next handful of months on this project. These are the key deliverables. Here are the key activities that we need to do. It's just not something that we see most commonly inside industry. So having that can be a real gap.
Absolutely. Okay, let's next address the policy risks. How do we mitigate those, Kim?
Sure. So we talked a little bit about best practice and introducing what are the best industry solutions and improvement opportunities that I can gain by implementing an ERP solution. So an ERP consultant naturally brings some of that best practice to the table. Plant Moran, for example, serves over 50 clients a year just in ERP projects. We have hundreds of thousands of hours of experience in the ERP marketplace. We bring process knowledge not only within specific industries, whether it be automotive or food and beverage or industrial, but we can bring some of the more cross-industry knowledge that might be applicable and further enhance the solution that you're looking for. Then secondly, really having an external resource on the team naturally introduces some objectivity. So Craig, you talked earlier about the propensity for a company to build up solutions on the side that can kind of fill those gaps, the Excel applications, the Access databases. Those types of things become almost like children to the people who develop them.
Absolutely.
And it's very hard for them to let go of those or to hear people talk negatively about those solutions, even if they recognize they may not be the best, right? So having an external resource come in that can just document what are the issues that we're having with our current solution, our legacy environment, what are our needs moving forward, the objectivity that an ERP consultant can bring is really invaluable.
Absolutely.
Agreed. Alrighty, let's go to our next audience question regarding who runs the implementations at your organization, or what have you seen in the past? The question being, in the last ERP selection project you participated in, who was the primary manager of the project? Was it IT? Was it finance, operations, or something else? I think in larger organizations with a CIO and a formal IT department, you tend to see ERP selections migrate towards that side of the fence. However, in some small organizations, I think a lot of times you see the business running it, whether it be finance or operations. Would you concur?
Yeah, I would say a very, very common approach, I think, is, and I think you nailed the lines very well. In a larger organization, you might have that IT function that does that. But we see a lot of the mid-sized companies that don't have a CIO, and often they report through a controller or a chief financial officer. And so it's kind of a pseudo IT because of the way that the direct report works. So I would say that would be the two most common scenarios that we probably have run into. And, you know, we talked a little bit about the idea of strengths and roles or capabilities. And you don't get a holistic approach unless you include the entire organization, right?
Absolutely. Okay, the responses are in. It appears that 25% of responders said that IT managed the last ERP selection project that they participated in. 50% said finance ran the last selection project that they participated in. And then operations was third with 11%. And then a few others either did no manager or other. And that's pretty consistent in the mid-size.
Yeah, you know what, 75% between IT and finance is probably pretty consistent with what we were expecting.
Absolutely. Okay. So again, let's switch and talk about how we mitigate politics risks in an organization.
Sure. So one of the key things that an ERP consultant brings to an ERP selection project is a predefined, repeatable process that has tool sets, has some sample deliverables, things of that nature. And having a predefined process and project structure naturally lends itself to mitigating some of the risks. So first and foremost, obviously, you want to involve members from across the entire organization. You want to have users from the shop floor, from each of your functional departments. You also want to involve members of your executive team. You want voices from across the entire company. And these folks need to be champions of change. They're going to drive that change through your organization, even through implementation. Secondly, you want to consider a team that involves both multifunctional, so members of your procurement, your finance, your sales and customer service teams, for example, but also if you are a multi-entity company, you need to consider members from those teams as well.
So when it comes to mitigating those, that's really a nice thing, is coming in and recognizing the different kinds of companies that we're working with. You know, walking in knowing this is a multi-country type scenario. How are we going to organize this differently than if it's a single location, or maybe there's some unique strategic plans that with regards to where the business is going that need to be considered. And the nice thing about working with an organization or a firm that does this a lot, it recognizes things pretty quickly, and it usually saves the client a fair amount of time and frustration, to be honest with you.
And if you're working with a company that has resources available in those specific areas, then they can apply those resources to the project as well to assist with some of those international needs or strategic needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's lastly go to how we mitigate priority risks. How do we make sure that the selection project stays top of mind for the organizations going through the selection?
Yeah, so I love talking about this. You know, we've walked into organizations that had, 17 people on an ERP selection team, and some that had a guy, who's going to be doing it. And, really understand that, people have a perspective of what they want to do, but there's a really effective way of managing a governance structure, managing a team when it comes to, who's on the core team and how is it represented. What are the skills in the internal project manager, and how are they best supported externally? And so having that experience and knowledge of building the team that makes sense for that organizational enterprise is really a valuable way to save a lot of time and energy that we can bring to the table. Next is, what are the expectations? So we've got this core team. Great. What needs to be done? When does it need to be done by? And what does success look like? Having those key attributes in there, and having, not necessarily the full carrot and the stick per se, but the idea of what does success look like and how do we find it, and what do we do when we're not finding it. That experience is very, very valuable to clients. Segregation of project activity we talk about. So the idea is there's a full life cycle to a selection project that we recommend. And there are some attributes that can be done with some more internal activities inside of a company, and others that really do require a lot of assistance from external firms, like Plant Moran, an example. And understanding how to build those out and what are the places that people need to focus on and how much is really valuable. And then finally, what does success overall look like? You know, our focus is quite simple when we go into a selection project. We have a planned schedule that we lay out in the beginning, work with the client and say, this is what we recommend, this is the amount of time, this is the budget, and here's the scope of work. This is the activities and the functional areas that we're going to be working from. And having that, that's what our playbook is. And so we build that and know what are those key activities. It's not inflexible, but at the same time, we do make sure there's accountability so that the client is getting what they expect at the end.
Absolutely. I think we found a lot of times our clients don't have that tool set to manage a project. They don't have PMI certified staff on hand. They don't have great weighted scorecards. They don't have great meeting templates. And that just really devalues the whole selection effort, in my opinion.
Sure.
So,
and the other aspect of that too is, and you alluded to it a little bit, when we come on site to do the selection activities of the day, right? We aren't focused on the operational fires that are going on back in the production floor or the inventory problems or the customer problems. Our only focus for that day that we're on site with the client is getting the activities complete and
the activities of the day, right?
Right, the activities of the day, focusing on the ERP project itself.
So I think what's very indicative of that is the next slide that shows what's the time consumed by a given activity if an organization chooses the DIY route. And we're not going to drill too much on this slide, but the essence of it is, without using someone who's done this multiple times, you don't have that synergy. You don't have that pre-work already completed. And it ends up costing you substantially in time.
Yeah, and again, we're not going to dig into this. You get some perspective here. There is a fair amount of time when you try to do it yourself. A lot of that is due to exactly what you said. When you're going at it the first time, you got to build everything from scratch. The nice thing is, in a requirements scenario, we say, okay, what's the industry? What are the recent selections we've done? Let's go in there with some pre-built discussion points to help get that requirements gathering going quickly. So when we're sitting down with a procurement team or we're sitting down with a production team, we're talking about things that are applicable as opposed to saying, okay, here's an empty page, let's start writing requirements. And so it's a huge benefit, and it's a very high risk. If you don't get your requirements down, the criticals, then you could potentially end up with something that you didn't want in the first place. Another one is talking about, contract review negotiation. We hit it pretty hard, but this is a very, very high risk point. The reason that people, spend, literally, we've seen $400,000 or $500,000 where we've been able to save clients just on how we build them out with them and negotiate with vendors, and that is just a huge benefit for the clients. So again, starting from scratch, granted you're looking at contracts, it's not as easy as working with a vendor where, a Plant Moran comes in, they do the contract review work and say, here's what we recommend, here's what we see works. Right. And then it's the client buying and saying, yeah, you know what, that's important to me. This is very important to me. Thank you. That really helps get us in a competitive advantage, if you will, in this selection.
Could we talk a little bit more about contract review? I know we've sort of belabored the point a little bit already, but I wanted to spend a little more time and talk about how it's just more than price. Certainly, negotiation, think about list price. How do we negotiate a discount off of list price? There are also other dimensions to a contract that need to be negotiated, such as support and a few other factors. You want to talk just briefly about where those other dimensions beyond price?
Absolutely. So, and this is kind of a pseudo dimension. So, of course, there is mutual protections, and there are things that when you have a scenario that you don't like the outcome, maybe in a hosting agreement, and you find out this hosting partner is not performing the goals, what does the termination look like? What's the difference between with cause and without cause? And what are the penalties around those? So that's an example of something that you can be hamstrung into something for multiple years if you don't have the appropriate protections in place with something that maybe could be commoditized.
How about in an acquisition scenario? How are you structuring a contract to be really of value in those acquisition, divestiture, carve-out situations?
So there's, in vendor contracts, there's a lot of undisclosed information. So one example would be, what if I sell this company? It just says it's non-transferable. This software is non-transferable. What's that mean? Well, in some scenarios, that means that it's a significant amount of cost that whoever's buying your organization is going to be paying. And so that's a good example of something that is in between the lines. Absolutely. That doesn't make it in there. But honestly, if you buy a $500,000 piece of software, it could be that I sold my company and all of a sudden there's another $150,000 price tag. Mm-hmm. unbeknownst to the client.
Exactly. Okay, so that takes us to our next point. With this expertise comes differences, however. And what are the aspects to look at when evaluating potential ERP selection partners? Or what's the criteria or some characteristics someone should care about when choosing an ERP partner?
Sure. So first is the concept of independence. There are quite a few ERP providers, selection providers out there that resell a particular ERP solution or maybe multiple solutions. So because of that, they're going to bring that particular solution to the table because they're going to experience financial gain if your organization purchases that particular solution. So it eliminates the idea that we talked about earlier. You need objectivity in your selection process to make sure that you are selecting the most appropriate solution for your organization.
I think another big thing to add as well is the life cycle of software, of ERP. Identifying, it's great. So this vendor, they do selections. But guess what? Maybe I needed something before the selection. Maybe I need somebody to look at my current state to give me a perspective. Should I be selecting new software? Or should I be optimizing my current stuff? If I've gone through this assessment and said, you know what, actually you could probably bring this one up to date and you'd be fine. Or here are some enhancements that you should consider that are available from the vendor and can get you optimized. All the way through a selection into the implementation. Having that breadth of services as a menu option, going from assessment all the way through like optimization after you implement, is very, very valuable to clients because as we go through an assessment with a client and say, okay, this is, we were able to obtain requirements and get a good start. Going into a selection, we already understand the organization. We've learned how to navigate the politics some, and working through this process on into all that knowledge you gain over months of ERP selection and negotiation and working with the client, you can carry that right on through the implementation and really just keep the momentum up with what that success looks like. So that's a huge benefit of having that full life cycle of ERP as opposed to just a selection or just technical aspects. But then there's a whole other side of the services offered that are not necessarily ERP. Guess what? We have to review our costing environment. Our costs are messed up, or we need to move from an actual to a standard environment. Or we're going to be getting a new ERP, but we don't have the infrastructure. We need somebody to come in and look at it and give us an idea of how to best remedy that. And that's a nice thing about a Plant Moran, is having that breadth of services that go across the organization, from med device knowledge, from compliance, from international, having sites in Mexico or India and China. That type of stuff is a really valuable extension of the bench, if you will, for our clients, because it doesn't mean you have to consume all the services. But isn't it nice to know that you have them available to you, as well as having somebody who can kind of help navigate that because of this selection?
How can a firm be more than just an ERP selection partner, but just a business partner in general? When evaluating ERP partners, who's got that breadth of resources available to them? I mean, I think we've seen forensic accounting come into play. If there's been some fraudulent activity, the books don't look right, and that's uncovered in one of our selection projects. We've got forensic accounting available to us. Just an interesting breadth of resources to elevate the engagement from an ERP selection to an overall business partner relationship. So that wraps things up. Let's just review a few key takeaways from the presentation today, and we'll move to Q&A.
Sure. So really to look at the value that ERP consultants can bring to your selection project, it's really the structure and the predefined process, the tool set, some of the sample or the toolkit that an ERP consultant can bring. It really structures the project and keeps the process moving along. We said it earlier, we're there to focus only on the ERP project and get it to a successful completion. And then finally, being able to insert our knowledge of the ERP market space and best practices not only within an industry but across multiple industries, getting a complete picture of the costs that are required. That's really going to enable an organization to make a better decision for a solution that will be in place for potentially 15 years.
Yeah, and then talking about, preparing for the implementation, we were hitting that pretty hard a moment ago, but the idea is, you're going to go through and you're going to purchase new software, and then you have to implement that software. And again, implementing the best software poorly ends up with a very poor outcome. And so having somebody who's already driving alongside you and helping through that selection right through the implementation is valuable. And honestly, you're making a decision for the next 15 years, and it's not an insignificant decision. It's large. It's large in money, and it's large in time and effort. And so doing that well is key. This is about, the selection is about 3% of the overall, effort of impact, that you're going to have, or time of using that software. Do it well and do it right. And having people who are experienced in that, in the hardware, experienced in, the different types of implementation offerings, from cloud to hosted to non-subscription based or on-premise type solutions, and how to negotiate that. It's just a huge valuable to have strong experience on your side in doing. It's not the place to cut corners, I would say.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, that takes us to Q&A now. So let's field some questions here. We've got about 5 minutes left in the presentation. Our first question is, who would you recommend be the lead person when putting a team together to come up with the requirements? This particular question was asked by a contract manufacturer, and they're sort of struggling with having IT exclusively decide what's best.
Sure. So it's a very good question. What's interesting is it's not about the role as much as it is about kind of the attributes or strengths of the individual. You need somebody on the inside who's going to help manage the process internally. So in other words, we're going to help facilitate the process on our side. So guiding that for the client side, say these are the activities. Here's the people we need in the room. Here's the type of resources we need in the room, and here we're going to lay out this calendar. Then we need somebody on the other side who can help kind of make that happen on the other side, right? And then you think about it, they need to be augmented with a leader and key decision maker, somebody who carries enough clout to get things done. So having those attributes in one or maybe even two people, it can be segregated, but the key is it's about the skills or the strengths.
I think it's a great point. I think we've seen a few situations where an organization has been very set and determined to give the project to a finance individual who has firm knowledge of costs and cost management. However, if they don't have that fundamental skill set, communication, leadership, management, clout, it doesn't matter where they roll up to, right?
Sure.
It's all about finding someone with the right skills and then setting them up for success. Kim, is that consistent with what you see?
Exactly. Okay. So really the resource needs to be able to manage people across the entire organization, involve the users, and ultimately communicate well with the leadership team and ultimately help them make the decision.
Good. Okay. Next question is, do you document process flows or as current state or future state?
So with regards to process flows, I mean, we have different clients who have different motivations, if you will. I think a big part of that driver can come from when you would do something like that might be related to whether you need a business case or not. If you're in a scenario that says it's 20 years old, I need to replace this and I don't need a big solid business case per se, then maybe the process is dealing with those during the implementation of the software, as long as we're able to obtain effective requirements and goals. So we can do some review of how are things done today to get a flyover and understand these are some important attributes and opportunities. We can build requirements out of those without formally drawing out every single process of the current state.
Okay. Kim?
Yeah, so a lot of projects that I've been involved with, we discuss the as-is process in order to document the requirements. Like you said, kind of a flyover. We've got to get our basic requirements down and understand those. But then there's a recognition that our ultimate future state process is going to look a little different depending upon which ERP solution we select. So the real detailed work in defining what that future state process model looks like is going to be deferred until the implementation time frame.
Okay, perfect. Well, that takes us through Q&A. We have just time for wrap-up left. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. We really appreciate your time. We'll be following up with you as needed, but again, appreciate your viewership and look forward to hearing more from us. Thank you.